Most importantly, she had no idea who I really was beneath the facade of helpless elderly woman she'd been tormenting for 3 years. That was about to change, and when it did, Veronica would finally understand the true cost of the cruelty she'd inflicted on someone she never should have underestimated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel burst through the front door, with the kind of controlled fury I'd never seen from my gentle son. His face was white with rage, his hands clenched into fists at his sides as he took in the scene before him. Veronica stood in the hallway looking like a deer caught in headlights, while I remained calm beside the evidence of her crimes. "Where is it?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Where's the recording device Mom found?" I held up the small device, and Daniel's expression grew even darker as he examined the sophisticated surveillance equipment his wife had hidden in their guest bathroom. This wasn't some amateur setup, this was professional-grade recording equipment that must have cost hundreds of dollars. "How long has this been going on?" he asked Veronica, his voice deadly quiet. "How long have you been secretly?" When my daughter-in-law Veronica forced me to scrub their toilet with my bare hands while her friends watched and laughed, she had no idea she was humiliating the woman who owned the very ground she stood on. That's when I decided it was time to show her exactly who held the real power in this family, and what happened next will leave you speechless. My name is Margaret Chen, and at 71 years old I thought I'd seen every form of cruelty humans could devise. I was wrong. The woman my son Daniel married 3 years ago has shown me depths of malice I never imagined possible, especially when wrapped in designer clothes and delivered with a perfect smile. It started small, as these things always do. When Daniel first brought Veronica home to meet me, she was all sweetness and light. She complimented my cooking, admired my small apartment in Chinatown, and even helped me with the dishes afterward. I remember thinking how lucky my son was to find such a thoughtful young woman. How naive I was. The first red flag should have been the way she looked around my modest 2-bedroom apartment with barely concealed disdain. At the time, I attributed it to nervousness about meeting her boyfriend's mother. The second red flag was how quickly she steered conversations toward money, always asking Daniel about his salary, his benefits, his prospects for advancement at the architectural firm where he worked. Again, I told myself she was just being practical, wanting to ensure financial security for their future together. The transformation began almost immediately after their engagement. Suddenly, my weekly dinners with Daniel became monthly, then sporadic. When I did see them, Veronica would dominate the conversation with talk of wedding plans that grew more elaborate by the week. A destination wedding in Tuscany, she announced one evening, completely ignoring my quiet mention that I'd never traveled overseas and wasn't sure I could afford such a trip. Daniel, my sweet boy who had always been so considerate, seemed to transform before my eyes. Where he once called me every few days just to check in, now our conversations became rushed, distracted. When I mentioned feeling left out of the wedding planning, he assured me that Veronica was just excited and wanted everything to be perfect. When I expressed concern about the cost, he told me not to worry about money, that they had everything under control. The wedding itself was a blur of expensive flowers, imported wine, and faces I didn't recognize. I sat at a table in the back corner with Daniel's elderly aunt and a few distant cousins, watching my son marry a woman who had already begun erasing me from his life. During the reception, when I approached to congratulate the happy couple, Veronica's smile was so cold it could have frozen champagne. After the honeymoon, they moved into a stunning colonial house in Westchester County, complete with a 3-car garage and a swimming pool. When Daniel gave me the tour, I marveled at the beautiful kitchen with its granite countertops and professional-grade appliances. Veronica mentioned casually that the mortgage was quite manageable thanks to Daniel's recent promotion and her own successful career in pharmaceutical sales. My first extended stay at their house came 6 months after the wedding, when I caught pneumonia and needed somewhere to recover. Daniel insisted I stay with them rather than struggle alone in my apartment. It seemed like such a generous offer at the time. I had no idea it was the beginning of my descent into a hell I never could have imagined. The rules started almost immediately. Veronica explained that since I'd be staying in their guest room for several weeks, we needed to establish some boundaries to make the arrangement work for everyone. I couldn't use the main bathroom during certain hours, because that's when she got ready for work. I needed to keep my belongings confined to the guest room to avoid cluttering their space. I should eat my meals in the kitchen rather than the dining room, which was reserved for when they entertained clients or friends. Each rule seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they created a clear hierarchy with me at the bottom. I was a guest being tolerated rather than family being welcomed. When I mentioned this to Daniel, he assured me that Veronica was just particular about her routine, and that I shouldn't take it personally. He was working long hours on a major project, he explained, and Veronica was under stress at her own job. Surely I could be understanding for a few weeks. Those few weeks stretched into 2 months, as my recovery proved slower than expected. The rules multiplied. I couldn't answer the front door when visitors came, because it might confuse their friends about who lived there. I needed to ask permission before using the washing machine because Veronica had a specific schedule for laundry. I should avoid the living room when they were watching television because my presence made their relaxation time feel crowded. The breaking point of that first day came when Veronica's college friends visited for a weekend. I was instructed to remain in the guest room during their visit to avoid any awkwardness about having Daniel's mother around during their social time. For 3 days, I stayed hidden away like some embarrassing family secret, emerging only to use the kitchen when I was certain the coast was clear. When I finally returned to my apartment, I told myself that the experience had been an anomaly. Veronica was young and still adjusting to married life. Having her mother-in-law around for an extended period had probably felt overwhelming. Surely things would improve once we all had some space and time to reset our relationship. I was wrong. The pattern had been established, and over the following months, every interaction with Veronica reinforced my position as an unwelcome intruder in my son's life. Phone calls to Daniel were answered by Veronica, who would take messages that somehow never got delivered. Invitations to family gatherings came with subtle discouragements about whether I'd really enjoy myself or feel comfortable with their friends. When my 71st birthday arrived, Daniel called to apologize that they couldn't celebrate with me because Veronica had planned a surprise getaway weekend for just the two of them. He promised we'd do something special when they returned, but that promise never materialized. Instead, 3 weeks later, I received a generic birthday card in the mail with a gift certificate to a chain restaurant, as if I were some distant acquaintance, rather than the woman who had raised him alone after his father died. The systematic erosion of my relationship with my son was so gradual, so carefully orchestrated, that I barely noticed it happening until it was too late.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Veronica was a master manipulator, always careful to maintain plausible deniability. When Daniel asked if I was happy, I found myself making excuses for her behavior rather than complaining, because her cruelty was always delivered with such surgical precision that describing it made me sound petty and vindictive. The second extended stay came 18 months later when I fell and broke my wrist. Once again, Daniel insisted I stay with them rather than struggle alone, and once again I walked into what I thought was generous hospitality, but quickly revealed itself as an opportunity for Veronica to exercise even more control over my daily existence. This time, the rules came with explanations about how my injury made me a liability. I couldn't be trusted to cook for myself, so I needed to wait for Veronica to prepare my meals. I couldn't drive with my wrist in a cast, so I was dependent on them for any errands or appointments. I couldn't even shower safely on my own, so Veronica would need to supervise my bathroom activities to ensure I didn't slip and hurt myself further. The supervision was the worst part. Veronica would stand in the bathroom doorway while I struggled to wash myself one-handed, offering commentary about how long I was taking or how much water I was wasting. She would count out my prescription pain medication each morning like I was a drug addict who couldn't be trusted with my own medicine. She would inspect my room daily under the guise of checking on my welfare, moving my belongings and reorganizing my space according to her preferences. When I protested that I was perfectly capable of managing my own medication and didn't need such intensive oversight, Veronica's response was delivered with false concern that made my skin crawl. She worried about elderly people becoming confused about their medication schedules. She'd read articles about seniors developing depression after injuries and wanted to monitor my mental state. She was only trying to ensure I recovered quickly so I could return to my independent life. Every protest I made was met with the same pattern. Veronica would express surprise that I was being so difficult when she was only trying to help. She would wonder aloud to Daniel whether his mother was becoming paranoid or ungrateful in her old age. She would suggest that perhaps I needed professional evaluation if I was having trouble accepting reasonable assistance during my recovery. The gaslighting was so sophisticated that I began to doubt my own perceptions. Maybe I was being unreasonable. Maybe I was becoming one of those difficult elderly people who created problems where none existed. Maybe Veronica really was trying to help, and my inability to appreciate her efforts said more about my mental state than her intentions. Daniel, caught in the middle and wanting to believe the best of everyone, accepted Veronica's version of events. When I tried to explain how her help felt more like control, he would point out how much time and energy she was investing in my care. When I mentioned feeling infantilized by her constant supervision, he would remind me that she was a healthcare professional who understood what recovering patients needed. The psychological warfare continued for 6 weeks until my wrist healed enough for me to regain my independence. By the time I returned to my apartment, I felt like a different person, smaller, more fragile, less certain of my own judgment. Veronica had succeeded in making me doubt not just my ability to care for myself, but my right to expect basic dignity and respect from my own family. The months that followed my recovery were marked by an increasing sense of isolation. Daniel's calls became even less frequent, and when we did speak, our conversations felt stilted and artificial. Veronica had trained him to see me as a burden rather than a beloved parent, and her success in reshaping his perspective was both impressive and heartbreaking. When holidays came around, I found myself relegated to the role of grateful recipient rather than family matriarch. Christmas dinner was served at whatever time was convenient for Veronica's schedule, with a menu chosen to accommodate her dietary preferences. I was expected to bring a side dish but not to participate in planning the meal or setting the table. I was welcome to join their celebration as long as I understood that it was their celebration, not ours. Easter brought a new low when Veronica announced that they decided to start their own traditions as a married couple, which meant spending the holiday with her family instead of including me. When I expressed disappointment, she suggested that perhaps I could find other elderly people in my building who might want to share a holiday meal. The implication was clear. I was no longer considered essential family, just someone who needed to be managed and occasionally accommodated. The pattern continued through birthdays, anniversaries, and every other milestone that had once brought our family together. Each event reinforced the new hierarchy Veronica had established, with herself at the top as the decision-maker and agenda-setter, Daniel in the middle as the devoted husband who prioritized his wife's wishes, and me at the bottom as the aging parent who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention were thrown my way. But the cruelest part wasn't the systematic exclusion from family celebrations or the gradual erosion of my relationship with my son. The cruelest part was how Veronica managed to make me complicit in my own diminishment. She was so skilled at framing her control as concern, her manipulation as care, that I found myself thanking her for treating me badly. When she rearranged my medication schedule to be more convenient for her oversight, I thanked her for being so thorough. When she limited my kitchen access to prevent me from making a mess, I apologized for being so clumsy. When she suggested that my memory might be failing because I couldn't keep track of all her rules and restrictions, I worried that she might be right. The psychological abuse was so subtle, so carefully disguised as legitimate concern, that even now I struggle to articulate exactly what she did to me. There were no obvious bruises, no explicit threats, no dramatic confrontations that would have made the situation clear to outside observers. Instead, there was a steady drip of small humiliations and casual dismissals that accumulated over time into something far more devastating than any single act of cruelty could have been. By the time the toilet incident occurred, I had been so thoroughly conditioned to accept Veronica's treatment that I almost didn't recognize it as abuse. I had become the frog in slowly boiling water, adapting to each increase in temperature until I no longer remembered what normal felt like. The third extended stay was supposed to be different. Daniel had been promoted to senior partner at his firm, and Veronica had received a significant bonus from a successful drug launch. They were in good moods, flush with success, and seemingly more generous in their treatment of me when I needed somewhere to stay while my apartment building underwent extensive renovations. For the first week, I allowed myself to believe that maybe our relationship had finally turned a corner. Veronica seemed more relaxed, less controlling, almost friendly in her interactions with me. She asked about my day, complimented my appearance, even suggested we might enjoy doing some activities together during my stay. I should have known it was too good to last. The change in her behavior wasn't a sign of improvement in our relationship. It was the calm before the storm, the setup for a humiliation so profound that it would finally reveal the true depths of her cruelty and force me to confront the reality of what she had been doing to me all along. The catalyst came on a Thursday afternoon when Veronica announced that her book club would be meeting at the house that evening. These weren't just any friends, she explained with obvious excitement. This was an exclusive group of influential women from the pharmaceutical industry, potential networking contacts who could advance her career significantly. Everything needed to be absolutely perfect. I offered to stay in my room during the meeting to avoid any disruption, but Veronica had a different idea. She needed help preparing for the evening, she said, and since I was staying there as their guest, surely I wouldn't mind contributing to the household efforts. It seemed like a reasonable request, and I was genuinely happy to help make the evening successful for her. The first tasks were normal enough. Dust the living room furniture, vacuum the carpets, arrange fresh flowers and vases around the house. I worked steadily through the afternoon, taking care to make everything spotless and welcoming. Veronica supervised my efforts with the kind of attention to detail I'd learned to expect from her, but her tone remained pleasant and appreciative. As the afternoon progressed, however, the tasks became more demanding. The kitchen needed to be completely reorganized so the catering supplies could be properly arranged. The good china needed to be washed by hand and carefully dried to eliminate any water spots. The guest bathroom needed special attention because some of the ladies might need to freshen up during the evening. It was while I was cleaning that guest bathroom, scrubbing the sink and mirror to Veronica's exacting standards, that I made the discovery that would change everything. I was reaching behind the toilet to clean the baseboards when my hand brushed against something that didn't belong there. A small recording device, no bigger than a thumb drive, attached to the back of the toilet with magnetic strips. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was looking at. Veronica had been recording my private moments in the bathroom. Every humiliation, every vulnerable moment, every time she had supervised my bathing or monitored my personal care, had been captured and stored for her entertainment or future use against me. The betrayal was so complete, so violating, that I couldn't process it at first. I sat on the bathroom floor, holding that tiny device in my trembling hands, trying to understand how anyone could be so cruel. This wasn't just psychological manipulation anymore. This was criminal behavior, a violation so profound that it went beyond mere cruelty into something approaching evil. I should have confronted her immediately. I should have demanded an explanation, threatened to call the police, insisted that Daniel be told about his wife's illegal surveillance. Instead, I found myself paralyzed by the implications of what I'd discovered. If Veronica was willing to secretly record me in the bathroom, what other boundaries had she crossed? What other violations had I endured without even knowing they were occurring? The sound of voices in the kitchen snapped me back to the present moment. Veronica's book club was arriving early, and I was still sitting on the bathroom floor clutching evidence of her crimes. I slipped the recording device into my pocket and finished cleaning the bathroom with hands that shook so badly I could barely hold the cleaning supplies. When I emerged from the bathroom, Veronica was greeting her guests in the living room with the kind of gracious hostess performance she had perfected over the years. These were clearly successful, sophisticated women, the kind of people Veronica wanted to impress and align herself with. They were complimenting the house, admiring the decorations, settling in for what promised to be an elegant evening of literary discussion and professional networking. Veronica introduced me as Daniel's mother, who was staying with them temporarily while her apartment was being renovated. The women nodded politely, the kind of acknowledgement one gives to hired help, who has been briefly mentioned but isn't expected to participate in the real business of the evening. I started to retreat to my room as planned, but Veronica had other ideas. Actually, she said with that bright smile I'd learned to fear, Margaret has been such a help getting ready for tonight. I think she'd enjoy hearing about our book selection. Why don't you stay for a few minutes? The invitation sounded generous, But something in her tone made my stomach clench with anticipation of what was really coming. I perched on the edge of a chair, trying to be as unobtrusive as possible while the women discussed their current book selection. The conversation was sophisticated, ranging from literary analysis to industry gossip to personal anecdotes about their professional achievements. I listened quietly, occasionally nodding or smiling when someone made a particularly insightful point. That's when Veronica began her performance. "Oh, Margaret," she said during a brief lull in the conversation. "I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but I've been so worried about you lately." The women turned their attention to me with polite interest, clearly not understanding that they were about to witness something terrible. "You see," Veronica continued with false concern, "Margaret has been staying with us while her living situation gets sorted out, and I've noticed some changes that have me concerned. Memory issues, confusion about basic tasks, difficulty maintaining personal hygiene standards. I've been trying to help her manage these challenges, but it's becoming quite overwhelming." The lies came so smoothly, delivered with such apparent sincerity, that even I almost believed them for a moment. The women nodded sympathetically, clearly viewing me with new eyes, as they processed this information about my supposed cognitive decline and inability to care for myself properly. "In fact," Veronica said, standing up with renewed energy, "I was just explaining to Margaret this afternoon that she needed to be more careful about bathroom cleanliness. Elderly people sometimes lose awareness of these things, you know." She walked over to where I sat, her smile never wavering. "Margaret, would you mind showing my friends how you cleaned the guest bathroom today? I want to make sure you understood my instructions correctly." The request hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. I could see the confusion on the women's faces as they tried to understand why their hostess would ask her elderly mother-in-law to demonstrate bathroom cleaning techniques during a book club meeting. But Veronica's smile was so confident, so assured, that they seemed to assume this was somehow normal behavior that they simply didn't understand. "I'm sure it's fine," I managed to say, trying to deflect the attention and return the conversation to safer ground. But Veronica wasn't finished with me yet. "No," she insisted, her voice taking on a sharper edge beneath the false sweetness. "I really think we should check your work. You know how important it is to maintain proper standards, especially when we have guests." She was already walking toward the guest bathroom, clearly expecting me to follow. The women exchanged glances, obviously uncomfortable with the strange direction the evening had taken, but uncertain how to respond. This was their hostess, after all, someone they wanted to maintain good relationships with for professional reasons. If she said this was normal, who were they to question it? I followed Veronica to the bathroom, my heart pounding as I realized she was about to humiliate me in front of these strangers in ways I couldn't even imagine yet. The recording device in my pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric, a reminder of just how far her cruelty extended. The guest bathroom looked immaculate, every surface gleaming from my careful attention that afternoon. But Veronica surveyed it with the critical eye of someone determined to find fault regardless of reality. "Oh, Margaret," she said with exaggerated disappointment, "this simply won't do. Look at these water spots on the faucet. And the toilet," she continued, lifting the lid to reveal a bowl that was obviously clean. "This needs much more attention. I specifically told you how important it was to get every surface completely spotless." The women had followed us down the hallway and were now crowded in the bathroom doorway, watching this bizarre scene unfold. I could see their discomfort growing, but also their fascination with what was clearly domestic drama playing out in front of them. "I think it looks fine," I said quietly, hoping to end this humiliating inspection and return to some semblance of normal social interaction. But Veronica was just getting started. "Fine isn't good enough when we have important guests," she replied firmly. "Margaret, I need you to clean this toilet properly. Right now, in front of everyone, so they can see that you understand what proper cleaning looks like." The demand was so outrageous that at first I didn't fully process what she was asking. Clean the toilet? Right now? In front of her book club? The very idea was so degrading, so inappropriate, that surely even Veronica wouldn't push things that far. But as I looked at her face, I saw something I'd never seen before. Not just manipulation or control, but genuine sadistic pleasure at my confusion and growing distress. She was enjoying this, feeding off my humiliation in front of these women who represented everything she aspired to become. "I don't think that's necessary," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The women in the doorway shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing that something was very wrong but uncertain how to intervene in what appeared to be a family matter. "Oh, but I think it is necessary," Veronica replied, her voice hardening. "You see, ladies, this is what I was telling you about. The confusion, the resistance to simple instructions, the inability to understand appropriate behavior. Margaret, I need you to clean this toilet properly, with your hands, so you can really feel whether it's clean enough." The words hit me like physical blows. With my hands. She wanted me to scrub the toilet with my bare hands while her friends watched, treating me like some kind of animal that needed to be trained through public humiliation. The cruelty was so pure, so perfectly calculated to destroy any remaining shred of dignity I possessed, that I felt something fundamental break inside me. But in that moment of complete degradation, something else happened. The recording device in my pocket seemed to pulse with significance, reminding me that I held evidence of Veronica's true nature. And somewhere deep in my mind, a voice that had been silent for too long finally spoke up with crystal clarity. "This ends now." I looked at Veronica standing there in her designer dress, surrounded by the professional women she was so desperate to impress, and realized that she had finally overplayed her hand. In her eagerness to humiliate me completely, she had revealed her true nature to witnesses who would never forget what they'd seen tonight. But I also realized something else, something that filled me with a calm certainty I hadn't felt in years. Veronica had no idea who she was really dealing with. She saw a frail elderly woman she could control and degrade at will. She had no clue that the person she was trying to break was someone who had spent decades building something she could never imagine. "I want to show you something," I said quietly, pulling out my phone. The women in the doorway leaned forward, clearly relieved that I was responding with something other than submission to Veronica's outrageous demand. "What are you doing?" Veronica asked, her confident mask slipping slightly as she realized I wasn't following the script she'd written for this humiliation. "I'm calling my son," I replied, keeping my voice steady and calm. "I think Daniel needs to know what's happening in his house right now. And then I'm calling the police to report the illegal recording device I found hidden in this bathroom." The change in Veronica's expression was instantaneous. The predatory confidence disappeared, replaced by something approaching panic as she processed what I'd just said. The women in the doorway gasped audibly, clearly shocked by this unexpected turn in the evening's events. "What recording device?" one of them asked, looking around the bathroom with new understanding of just how wrong this situation had become. "This one," I said, pulling the small device from my pocket. "I found it attached to the back of the toilet while I was cleaning. Veronica has been secretly recording my private moments in this bathroom for who knows how long." The silence that followed was deafening. The book club members stared at Veronica with expressions of disgust and horror, clearly realizing that they had almost become accomplices to something truly despicable. Veronica herself stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find some explanation that could possibly justify what had been revealed. "I don't know anything about that," she finally managed, but her voice lacked any conviction. "You must have put it there yourself. You're confused, Margaret. This is exactly what I was telling everyone about your mental state." But her attempts at gaslighting fell flat in front of witnesses who had just seen her try to force an elderly woman to clean a toilet with her bare hands. The context made it impossible for anyone to believe that I was the one behaving irrationally. Daniel answered on the second ring, his voice warm and relaxed as he greeted me from his office downtown. "Mom, what's up? Is everything okay at the house?" "No, Daniel, everything is not okay," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the small bathroom where everyone could hear both sides of the conversation. "Your wife just tried to force me to clean your toilet with my bare hands in front of her book club, and I found an illegal recording device she's been using to spy on me in the bathroom." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long, I thought the call might have dropped. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was completely different, cold and sharp in a way I'd never heard before. "She did what? Put her on the phone. Now." Veronica shook her head frantically, backing away from me as if the phone itself might attack her. "I can't talk right now," she whispered. "I have guests." "No," I said firmly, holding the phone out toward her. "You can talk now, or you can explain to the police when they arrive. Your choice." The women in the doorway were pulling out their own phones, clearly documenting this scene for their own protection, and probably sharing it with others in their network. Veronica's reputation in her professional circle was being destroyed in real time, and she was powerless to stop it. "Give me the phone," she said finally, her voice barely audible. Her hands shook as she took it from me, and I could see the terror in her eyes as she raised it to her ear. "Daniel," she said tentatively. "Hi, honey. I think there's been a misunderstanding." I couldn't hear his response, but I could see its effect on Veronica's face. What little color remained in her cheeks drained away completely, and she actually staggered backward as if his words had physically struck her. "I can explain," she said desperately. "It's not what she's making it sound like. She's been so difficult lately, and I was just trying to help her understand proper hygiene standards." The response from Daniel was apparently even worse, because Veronica started crying. Not the elegant tears of a woman seeking sympathy, but the ugly, desperate sobs of someone whose world was collapsing around them. "Please don't come home yet," she begged. "Let me handle this situation first. I can make this right." But it was clear from her increasingly frantic tone that Daniel wasn't agreeing to give her time to manage the crisis. She handed the phone back to me with shaking hands, unable to continue the conversation. I could hear Daniel's voice through the speaker, tight with controlled fury. "Mom, are you hurt? Are you safe right now?" "I'm fine, Daniel," I said calmly. "Your wife's friends are here, and they've seen everything that happened. I'm in no immediate danger. I'm leaving the office right now. Don't let her intimidate you, or try to convince you to change your story. And Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you years ago when you tried to tell me something was wrong." The apology hit me harder than all of Veronica's cruelty combined, because it meant that my son was finally seeing the truth that had been hidden for so long. But it also meant reckoning with 3 years of systematic abuse that we had both enabled through our silence and denial. After I hung up the phone, the bathroom fell into uncomfortable silence. The book club members were clearly eager to leave this toxic situation, but also seemed uncertain about whether it was safe to abandon me alone with Veronica. Their hostess had just been exposed as someone capable of illegal surveillance and psychological abuse, and they were probably questioning everything they thought they knew about her. "I think we should postpone tonight's meeting," one of the women said diplomatically. "Veronica, perhaps you should focus on resolving this family situation." But as they gathered their purses and prepared to leave, it was clear that this wasn't just a postponement. These were professional women who couldn't afford to be associated with someone whose judgment and character had been so thoroughly compromised. Veronica's networking ambitions had just been destroyed along with her reputation. "Don't go," Veronica pleaded as they filed out of the bathroom. "Please, let me explain what's really happening here. Margaret has been having these episodes, and I've been trying to help her, but she gets confused and makes up stories." The desperation in her voice was painful to hear, but none of the women were buying her explanations anymore. They had seen too much, heard too much, to accept that I was the problem in this situation. Their polite goodbyes were clearly final, and Veronica seemed to understand that these professional relationships were permanently severed. As the front door closed behind the last guest, the house fell into an eerie quiet. Veronica and I stood in the hallway looking at each other, both of us understanding that everything had changed irrevocably. There would be no going back to the previous dynamic, no pretending that tonight's revelations could be explained away or forgotten. "You've ruined everything," she said finally, her voice flat with defeat. "Do you understand what you've just done to me?" Those women control access to every major pharmaceutical company in the region. "My career is over. Your career is over because of your own choices," I replied calmly. "I didn't force you to install illegal recording equipment in your bathroom. I didn't make you try to humiliate an elderly woman in front of your colleagues. You did that all by yourself." But even as I spoke those words, I knew that Veronica's professional destruction was only the beginning. Daniel was on his way home, and when he arrived, there would be a reckoning that went far beyond tonight's immediate crisis. 3 years of psychological manipulation and abuse were about to be exposed, and the consequences would reshape all of our lives. The sound of Daniel's car in the driveway came sooner than I expected. He must have broken every speed limit between downtown and Westchester to arrive so quickly, As his key turned in the front door, I saw Veronica brace herself for a confrontation that would determine whether her marriage survived the night. But she had no idea that the recording device was only the tip of the iceberg. She didn't know about the evidence I'd been quietly gathering for months, or the resources I had at my disposal to ensure that tonight's revelations had lasting consequences. Most importantly, she had no idea who I really was beneath the facade of helpless elderly woman she'd been tormenting for 3 years. That was about to change, and when it did, Veronica would finally understand the true cost of the cruelty she'd inflicted on someone she never should have underestimated. Daniel burst through the front door with the kind of controlled fury I'd never seen from my gentle son. His face was white with rage, his hands clenched into fists at his sides as he took in the scene before him. Veronica stood in the hallway looking like a deer caught in headlights, while I remained calm beside the evidence of her crimes. "Where is it?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Where's the recording device Mom found?" I held up the small device, and Daniel's expression grew even darker as he examined the sophisticated surveillance equipment his wife had hidden in their guest bathroom. This wasn't some amateur setup, this was professional-grade recording equipment that must have cost hundreds of dollars. "How long has this been going on?" he asked Veronica, his voice deadly quiet. "How long have you been secretly recording my mother in our bathroom?" Veronica's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I could see her mind racing, trying to find some explanation that could possibly justify what had been discovered. But there was no innocent explanation for hidden surveillance equipment in a bathroom, and we all knew it. "Daniel, please," she finally managed, her voice shaking. "You have to understand, I was worried about her. She's been acting so strangely lately, and I thought maybe if I could document some of her episodes, we could get her the help she needs." The lie was so transparent, so insulting to our intelligence, that I actually laughed. The sound seemed to surprise everyone, including myself. But there was something liberating about finally being able to express my true feelings instead of swallowing them to keep the peace. "Episodes?" I repeated, looking directly at Veronica. "Is that what you call it when someone refuses to let you humiliate them? When someone won't submit to being treated like hired help in their own son's house?" Daniel's attention shifted to me, and I could see him processing this new information. "Mom, what do you mean? What's been going on that I don't know about?" The question I'd been waiting 3 years to answer had finally been asked. But now that the moment had arrived, I found myself uncertain where to begin. How do you summarize years of systematic psychological abuse in a way that captures its true impact? How do you explain the death of dignity by 1,000 small cuts? Your wife has been recording me in the bathroom, Daniel. Not to document episodes or help me get medical care, but for her own entertainment. She's been systematically humiliating me every time I stay in this house, treating me like a servant while you're at work, making me feel unwelcome in my own family. Veronica stepped forward, her desperation making her bold. "That's not true, Daniel. She's confused, just like I told you. Look at what she's saying now, making up these elaborate stories about being mistreated. This is exactly the kind of paranoid behavior I've been trying to help her with." But Daniel was no longer looking at his wife with the trusting eyes of a devoted husband. He was studying her face with the analytical skills that had made him successful in architecture, looking for structural flaws that might bring down the entire edifice of their marriage. "Mom," he said carefully, "tell me exactly what happened tonight. Don't leave anything out." So I told him. I described how Veronica had asked for help preparing for her book club, how the tasks had escalated throughout the day, how she had orchestrated the bathroom inspection in front of her professional colleagues. I explained how she had tried to force me to clean the toilet with my bare hands while her friends watched, turning my humiliation into entertainment for women she wanted to impress. With each detail, Daniel's face grew more ashen. These weren't the actions of someone concerned about an elderly relative's well-being. These were the calculated cruelties of someone who enjoyed exercising power over a vulnerable person. When I finished my account of the evening, the silence stretched between us like a chasm. Veronica seemed to realize that her usual tactics of gaslighting and manipulation weren't working in the face of such specific, detailed accusations delivered in front of a witness. "Daniel," she tried again, her voice taking on a pleading tone, You know how much stress I've been under at work. The new product launch, the pressure to network with industry leaders, the responsibility of maintaining our household while building my career. Sometimes I say things or act in ways that might seem harsh, but it's only because I'm trying to manage so many different demands. The excuse was carefully crafted to appeal to Daniel's protective instincts while painting her as the victim of circumstances beyond her control. But it also revealed something important about Veronica's psychology. She genuinely believed that her stress justified treating other people as disposable objects to be used for her convenience. "Let me understand this correctly," Daniel said slowly. "You're saying that your work stress made you install hidden cameras in our guest bathroom to spy on my mother?" When he put it that way, the absurdity of Veronica's explanation became impossible to ignore. No amount of professional pressure could justify illegal surveillance of a family member in their most private moments. "I never said I installed cameras," Veronica protested weakly. "I said I was worried about her mental state and thought documentation might help with her medical care." But Daniel was already examining the recording device more closely, his architectural training giving him insights into its installation and purpose that Veronica probably hadn't anticipated. "This isn't a medical monitoring device," he said grimly. "This is sophisticated surveillance equipment designed for covert recording. It has hours of storage capacity and a battery life measured in weeks. This wasn't installed recently for temporary monitoring, Veronica. This has been here for a long time." The technical analysis hit Veronica like a physical blow. She hadn't expected Daniel to be able to evaluate the equipment so knowledgeably, and his expertise had just destroyed her last viable excuse. "How long?" Daniel asked again, his voice growing colder with each repetition. "How long have you been secretly recording my mother in our bathroom?" "I don't know," Veronica whispered, finally admitting her involvement. "Maybe a few months. I was just trying to understand her behavior patterns so I could help her better." "Months." The word hung in the air like an accusation. "For months, Veronica had been violating my privacy in the most fundamental way possible, recording my most vulnerable moments for purposes I could only imagine. The betrayal was so complete that I felt physically sick thinking about all the times I'd used that bathroom, unaware that my every action was being captured and stored." Daniel set the recording device on the hallway table and looked at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before. This wasn't anger anymore, it was something far more dangerous. Complete loss of trust. "Show me the recordings," he said simply. "What?" Veronica's voice cracked with panic. "Show me the recordings," Daniel repeated. "If you were documenting Mom's behavior for medical purposes, then you won't mind sharing that documentation with me. I want to see exactly what you've been capturing and how you've been helping her." The demand was reasonable on its face, but we all knew what those recordings would actually reveal. They wouldn't show an elderly woman having cognitive episodes that required medical intervention. They would show Veronica's systematic abuse, her cruel supervision of my most private moments, her obvious pleasure in exercising control over someone she perceived as powerless. "I deleted them," Veronica said quickly. "Once I realized they weren't helpful for understanding her condition, I deleted everything to protect her privacy." Another lie. And a clumsy one. Daniel's expression made it clear that he wasn't buying any of her explanations anymore. "You know what I think?" he said, his voice taking on the kind of calm that preceded major decisions. "I think you've been lying to me for months, maybe years, about how you've been treating my mother. I think tonight's humiliation was just the latest in a long series of cruelties that you've been hiding from me." Veronica's facade of victimhood finally cracked completely. The mask slipped, and for a moment I saw the real person underneath. Someone who was furious at being caught, not remorseful about what she'd done. "Your mother has been nothing but a burden since the day we got married," she snapped, her voice full of venom. "Every time she comes to stay, my life gets more complicated. She's needy, demanding, critical of everything I do. I've been trying to manage an impossible situation while you remain completely oblivious to how difficult she makes things." The honesty was brutal but also liberating. Finally, Veronica was revealing her true feelings instead of hiding behind fake concern and manufactured excuses. Daniel could see exactly what kind of person he'd married, and I could stop wondering if I'd been imagining the hostility I'd felt for so long. So you decided to handle the situation by installing illegal surveillance equipment and trying to humiliate her in front of your colleagues? Daniel's voice was incredulous. That was your solution to feeling burdened by my mother's presence? I was trying to get her to leave on her own, Veronica admitted, apparently deciding that honesty was her only remaining option. I thought if I made her uncomfortable enough, she'd stop coming to stay with us, and we could have our lives back. There it was. 3 years of systematic psychological abuse, laid bare in a single sentence. Veronica hadn't been confused or overwhelmed or struggling with legitimate concerns about my well-being. She had been deliberately torturing me in hopes of driving me away from my own family. Daniel stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. The woman he'd married, the person he'd pledged to build a life with, had just admitted to conducting a campaign of psychological warfare against his mother. The betrayal wasn't just of me, but of him, of everything he'd believed about their marriage. "You've been deliberately cruel to my mother for 3 years," he said slowly, as if testing the words to see how they sounded. "You've been lying to me about your relationship with her, manipulating me into thinking she was the problem, all while secretly abusing her in ways I never could have imagined." The full scope of Veronica's deception was finally becoming clear to him. She hadn't just been mean to his mother occasionally, or struggled with legitimate interpersonal conflicts. She had orchestrated a systematic campaign designed to destroy my relationship with my son and drive me out of his life permanently. Daniel pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. "What are you doing?" Veronica asked, alarm creeping back into her voice. "I'm calling the police," he replied without looking up. "Installing hidden cameras in someone's bathroom without their consent is illegal. What you've done to my mother isn't just cruel, it's criminal." The threat of legal consequences seemed to shock Veronica back into manipulation mode. "Daniel, please, you can't call the police. Think about what this would do to our reputation, to your career, to our future together. We can work this out as a family without involving law enforcement." But Daniel had already placed the call. "Yes, I'd like to report illegal surveillance equipment found in my home. My wife has been secretly recording my mother in our guest bathroom without her knowledge or consent." As Daniel provided our address and details to the emergency dispatcher, I watched Veronica's world continue to collapse around her. The police involvement meant this situation was moving beyond private family drama into official criminal investigation. Her professional reputation, already damaged by tonight's book club disaster, was about to be completely destroyed. When Daniel hung up the phone, Veronica made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "This is all because of her," she said, pointing at me with shaking fingers. "She's turned you against me with her lies and manipulation. Can't you see what she's doing? She's destroying our marriage because she's jealous of our happiness." The accusation was so absurd, so completely divorced from the reality of what had just been revealed, that I almost felt sorry for her. This was what happened when someone's entire worldview was built on lies and self-deception. When reality finally intruded, they couldn't process it in any rational way. "Mom," Daniel said, turning to me with an expression of profound regret, "I need you to know how sorry I am. I should have seen what was happening. I should have protected you instead of enabling her behavior by refusing to acknowledge it." The apology was everything I'd needed to hear for 3 years, but now that it had finally come, I found myself focused on something else entirely. Daniel and Veronica were so caught up in their marital crisis that they hadn't yet asked the most important question. How had a supposedly helpless elderly woman managed to navigate this situation with such confidence and strategic thinking? That question was about to become very relevant, because the police investigation would reveal far more than just Veronica's illegal surveillance. It would uncover the carefully documented evidence I'd been gathering for months, evidence that would expose the full scope of her psychological abuse and ensure that tonight's consequences extended far beyond a single criminal charge. But most importantly, it would force me to reveal the truth about who I really was, resources I had at my disposal, and why Veronica's choice to target me had been the most catastrophic mistake of her life. The sound of sirens in the distance announced that our private family crisis was about to become a matter of public record. As we waited for the police to arrive, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. For 3 years, I had allowed Veronica to make me feel small, powerless, dependent on her mercy for basic dignity and respect. Tonight, that dynamic had been permanently reversed. The question now wasn't whether Veronica would face consequences for her actions, but how severe those consequences would be. And that would depend entirely on what the investigation revealed about the full extent of her crimes and the resources available to ensure justice was served. As the police cars pulled into the driveway, their red and blue lights flashing through the windows of the house, I realized that this moment marked not just the end of Veronica's campaign of abuse, but the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape all of our lives in ways none of us could yet imagine. The officers who entered the house were professional and thorough, taking detailed statements from each of us about the evening's events and the discovery of the recording device. They photographed the surveillance equipment, documented its location and installation, and began the process of treating our home as a crime scene. Veronica's attempts to minimize her actions fell flat in the face of such official scrutiny. When she tried to suggest that the recording device might have been installed by someone else, the lead detective pointed out that only household members would have had the access and knowledge necessary to hide surveillance equipment so effectively. When she claimed that her intentions had been medical rather than malicious, the detective asked to see any documentation supporting her concerns about my mental health. Of course, no such documentation existed, because Veronica's claims about my cognitive decline had been fabrications designed to justify her abuse. The most damaging moment came when the detective asked to examine the device's storage capacity and battery life. His technical analysis confirmed what Daniel had already determined. This was sophisticated equipment designed for long-term covert surveillance, not temporary medical monitoring. "Ma'am," the detective said to Veronica, "this device has been in place for at least 3 months, possibly longer. It has hours of recorded material stored in its memory. Are you telling me that you installed professional surveillance equipment to monitor someone you believed was having medical episodes, and then forgot to review any of the footage to assess their condition?" The question highlighted the absurdity of Veronica's medical excuse. If she had genuinely been concerned about my well-being, she would have been actively monitoring the recordings to document concerning behaviors. Her claim that she had deleted everything without review made no sense in the context of legitimate medical observation. "Mrs. Chen," the detective said, turning to me, "we'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to provide a more detailed statement about your experiences in this household. Based on what we've heard tonight, it's possible that the illegal surveillance was part of a broader pattern of psychological abuse that we'll need to investigate thoroughly." The word investigate seemed to hit Veronica like a physical blow. She understood that police investigations had a way of uncovering secrets that people preferred to keep hidden. If detectives started looking closely at her treatment of me over the past 3 years, they would find evidence of systematic abuse that went far beyond a single recording device. What evidence? The question I'd been waiting for had finally been asked, and now I could begin to reveal the true scope of what Veronica had unleashed with her cruelty. "I've been keeping detailed records," I said calmly. "I have documentation of abusive incidents, photographs of injuries, recordings of conversations where Veronica discussed her intentions to make me uncomfortable enough to leave voluntarily. I've been building a case for months, waiting for the right moment to use it." The silence that followed my revelation was profound. Daniel stared at me with a mixture of admiration and horror, clearly realizing that his mother had been far more strategic and resourceful than anyone had imagined. Veronica looked like she might faint as the implications of my words sank in. "You've been recording us?" she whispered, the irony apparently lost on her. "I've been protecting myself," I corrected. When someone begins a campaign of psychological abuse against you, documentation becomes essential for establishing patterns of behavior and protecting yourself from gaslighting. The detective asked to see this documentation, and I retrieved my tablet from my room. For months, I had been carefully cataloging every incident of abuse, every cruel comment, every attempt to manipulate or control my behavior. The evidence was comprehensive, detailed, and damning. As the detective scrolled through my records, his expression grew increasingly grim. This wasn't just a case of illegal surveillance anymore. This was systematic psychological abuse, documented with the kind of thoroughness that would make prosecution straightforward and conviction likely. "Mrs. Harrison," he said to Veronica, "based on what I'm seeing here, you're going to be facing charges that go well beyond illegal surveillance. Psychological abuse of an elderly person is a serious felony in this state, especially when it involves systematic attempts to isolate the victim from family support systems. The legal terminology seemed to paralyze Veronica completely. She had thought she was dealing with a harmless elderly woman who could be abused with impunity. She had never imagined that her victim might be sophisticated enough to build a legal case that could result in criminal prosecution and prison time. But the biggest revelation was still to come. As the detective continued his examination of my documentation, he came across financial records that would change everything we thought we knew about the power dynamics in this household. "Mrs. Chen," he said, looking up from the tablet with a puzzled expression, "some of these documents appear to be corporate filings and property deeds. Can you explain why you have business records mixed in with your abuse documentation?" The question I'd been anticipating for 3 years had finally been asked. It was time to reveal the truth that would turn this entire situation on its head and show Veronica exactly how catastrophic her choices had been. "Because," I said quietly, "those businesses and properties are mine." Veronica has been systematically abusing someone she assumed was powerless, but she never bothered to investigate who she was really dealing with. The revelation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Daniel looked at me with complete confusion, clearly trying to process this new information about his mother that contradicted everything he thought he knew. Veronica's face went completely white as she began to understand that she might have made a mistake of unimaginable proportions. "What do you mean they're yours?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I said, looking directly at Veronica as I spoke, that the woman you've been treating like a helpless dependent actually owns a portfolio of commercial properties worth approximately $12 million, along with several successful businesses that generate substantial monthly income. The words hit the room like a physical force. Daniel staggered backward as if I'd slapped him, while Veronica made a sound like air being let out of a balloon. The detective stopped scrolling through my tablet and stared at me with new understanding of just how complicated this case had become. "Mom," Daniel said weakly, "I don't understand. If you have that kind of money, why have you been living in a small apartment? Why did you let us think you needed financial help?" "Because," I replied, "I wanted to see who you both really were when you thought I had nothing to offer you except the burden of caring for an aging parent. I wanted to know if your love was conditional on what I could provide, or if it was genuine affection for the person who raised you." The test had been more revealing than I'd ever imagined it could be. Daniel had continued to love and care for me even when he believed I was financially dependent on his support. But Veronica had revealed herself to be someone who viewed people solely in terms of their utility, someone who felt justified in abusing anyone she perceived as powerless or burdensome. And now, the consequences of her abuse were about to become far more severe than a simple criminal charge. When you systematically abuse someone who has the resources to ensure justice is served, the results tend to be comprehensive and permanent. The detective was looking at me with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal amazement. "Mrs. Chen," he said, "you've essentially been conducting an undercover investigation of your own abuse while building a criminal case against your abuser. This is one of the most thorough documentation efforts I've ever seen in a domestic abuse case." "I've had a lot of practice building cases," I replied. "My businesses require careful attention to legal details and evidence preservation." When Veronica began her campaign against me, I simply applied those same skills to protecting myself and ensuring she would face appropriate consequences for her actions. Veronica finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "You're rich? You've been rich this whole time, and you let me think you were just some poor old woman who needed our charity?" The question revealed everything wrong with Veronica's character in a single sentence. She wasn't horrified by her abuse of someone she'd thought was vulnerable. She was upset that she'd wasted her cruelty on someone who turned out to have resources to fight back. Her regret wasn't moral, it was strategic. "I let you reveal who you really are," I corrected. "I gave you every opportunity to treat me with basic human decency, regardless of what you thought I could offer you. You chose cruelty instead, and now you're going to live with the consequences of that choice." The police finished their initial investigation and left with promises to continue their work the next day. The recording device was taken as evidence, along with copies of my documentation and preliminary statements from all involved parties. Veronica was informed that she should expect formal charges to be filed within 48 hours. As the officers departed, the three of us were left alone in the house that had been the site of so much hidden abuse. But everything had changed now. The power dynamics that had defined our relationships for 3 years had been completely reversed, and we were all struggling to understand what came next. Daniel looked at me with a mixture of love, regret, and amazement. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Have you been financially supporting us without us knowing it?" The question cut to the heart of everything that was about to be revealed. Because Veronica's abuse hadn't just been directed at someone who turned out to be wealthy. It had been directed at someone who had been secretly ensuring her comfortable lifestyle all along. "Yes," I said simply, "the down payment on this house, your business loans, Veronica's car payments, your children's college funds, all of it has been funded through my businesses and investments. I've been the financial foundation of your family life while your wife has been systematically abusing me for being a burden." The revelation was the final piece of a puzzle that painted a picture of Veronica's character so damning that it bordered on the unbelievable. She had been torturing the very person whose generosity had made her lifestyle possible, abusing someone while simultaneously benefiting from their secret support. Daniel turned to look at his wife with an expression of complete disgust. "Everything we have, everything you've enjoyed, everything you've used to impress your friends and build your career, it all came from the woman you've been trying to drive out of our lives." Veronica's world wasn't just collapsing anymore. It had been completely inverted. The person she'd thought was beneath her consideration turned out to be the source of everything she valued in her life. The abuse she'd inflicted on someone she'd assumed was powerless would now be punished by someone with unlimited resources to ensure justice was served. But the night's revelations were far from over. As we stood in that hallway, surrounded by the wreckage of lies and abuse that had defined our family for years, I realized that it was time to show Veronica the full scope of what her cruelty had cost her. Because criminal charges and public humiliation were just the beginning. When you wage war against someone who has spent decades building wealth and power, the consequences extend far beyond what any court system can impose. And Veronica was about to learn exactly what it meant to have made an enemy of someone who had both the means and the motivation to ensure that justice was comprehensive and lasting. The morning light streaming through the kitchen windows felt different somehow, as if the entire world had shifted overnight. I sat at the breakfast table with my coffee, watching Daniel pace back and forth while Veronica remained upstairs, presumably trying to process the magnitude of her situation. The police had left hours ago, but their investigation was just beginning, and everyone in the house understood that yesterday's revelations were merely the opening act of a much larger drama. Daniel finally stopped his restless movement and sat down across from me, his face drawn with exhaustion and something deeper. A fundamental reassessment of everything he'd believed about his life and family. "Mom," he said quietly, "I need you to help me understand something. How long have you been planning this? How long have you known that Veronica was abusing you while secretly funding our lifestyle?" The question was fair, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. Part of him was grateful that I'd exposed his wife's true nature, but another part was struggling with the realization that his mother had been conducting an elaborate deception of her own, albeit for very different reasons. "I've been documenting her behavior for about 18 months, I replied honestly. "But I've been financially supporting your family since before you got married. I wanted to see if your relationship with me would change once you had other priorities. And I wanted to understand what kind of person Veronica really was when she thought I had nothing to offer." The silence stretched between us as Daniel processed this information. His mother had been testing him and his wife for years. And while he had passed that test by continuing to love and care for me regardless of my perceived financial status, Veronica had failed spectacularly by revealing depths of cruelty that shocked even someone who'd lived as long as I had. So the apartment in Chinatown, the concerns about medical bills, the way you always seemed worried about money, all of that was an act? Not an act, I corrected. A test. I really do live simply and prefer modest surroundings. I really am careful about unnecessary expenses, because that's how you build and maintain wealth over decades. But I also wanted to see how you both treated someone you perceived as financially vulnerable. Daniel nodded slowly, understanding the distinction. His continued kindness toward me even when he believed I was struggling financially had proven that his love was genuine rather than conditional. But Veronica's escalating abuse had revealed her to be someone who viewed relationships purely in terms of power and utility. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Veronica's descent from the bedroom where she'd been hiding since the police left. She appeared in the kitchen doorway looking haggard and defeated, her usually perfect appearance disheveled and her eyes red from crying. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All three of us. About what happens next." I gestured to the empty chair at the table, but Veronica remained standing, apparently too agitated to sit still. The confident, manipulative woman who had tormented me for years had been replaced by someone who was clearly terrified about her future. "I've been thinking all night about what you said," she continued, addressing me directly for the first time since the police had left. "About the money. About the businesses. About how you've been supporting us without us knowing. I need to understand what that means for the charges I'm facing." The question revealed Veronica's priorities with crystalline clarity. Even now, faced with the destruction of her marriage and the prospect of criminal prosecution, her primary concern was how to minimize the consequences of her actions, rather than expressing any genuine remorse for the harm she'd caused. "What it means," I said calmly, "is that your situation is far worse than you realize. When you systematically abuse someone who has significant resources, the consequences tend to be comprehensive and lasting. Criminal charges are just the beginning." Veronica's face went pale as she began to understand that her legal troubles might be the least of her problems. Someone with my financial resources could pursue justice through multiple channels, and criminal court was only one avenue available for ensuring that her cruelty was appropriately punished. "What are you saying?" Daniel asked, looking between his wife and his mother with growing concern. "Mom, what exactly are you planning to do?" I pulled out my tablet and opened a folder I'd been preparing for months, one that contained far more than just documentation of Veronica's abuse. This folder contained the comprehensive plan I'd developed for ensuring that her cruelty would have consequences that extended far beyond anything the legal system could impose. "I'm saying that Veronica's abuse of me has been funded by my own money," I explained, showing them financial records that detailed every expense related to their household. "The house she's been treating me like a servant in belongs to me. The car she drives to work every day was purchased with my money. The lifestyle she's used to impress her professional colleagues has been entirely subsidized by the woman she's been systematically torturing." The revelation hit them both like a physical blow. Veronica staggered backward and grabbed the doorframe for support, while Daniel's face went completely white as he processed the full implications of what I was saying. "You own our house?" he asked weakly. "I own this house, the rental properties that generate your monthly income, the business investments that fund your retirement accounts, and the trust funds that will pay for your children's education. Veronica has been abusing the person who made her entire comfortable life possible." The scope of my financial involvement in their lives was even more extensive than they had imagined. I hadn't just been providing occasional help or support during difficult times. I had been the invisible foundation underlying every aspect of their financial security. Veronica finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "Why? Why would you do that without telling us? Why would you let us think we were independent when we were really dependent on your charity?" "Charity?" I repeated, allowing some of my anger to show for the first time. "You think ensuring my son's financial security was charity? You think wanting to provide for my grandchildren's future was some kind of manipulation?" The characterization of my generosity as charity revealed everything that was wrong with Veronica's perspective. She couldn't understand the concept of family support that wasn't transactional, love that wasn't conditional on what the recipient could provide in return. But more importantly, her question showed that she still didn't grasp the true magnitude of her situation. She was worried about why I hadn't revealed my wealth sooner, not acknowledging that her abuse of someone with my resources was about to destroy every aspect of the life she'd built. Daniel stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his shoulders shaking with emotion. For several minutes, none of us spoke as he processed the revelation that his entire adult life had been built on a foundation he'd never known existed. When he finally turned back to face us, his expression was a mixture of gratitude and profound regret. "Mom, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for us, But I also don't know how to forgive myself for not seeing what Veronica was doing to you, while you were secretly ensuring our security and happiness." The pain in his voice was heartbreaking, but I could also see something else emerging. A clear understanding of exactly what kind of person he'd married and what that meant for their future together. Veronica seemed to sense the shift in Daniel's attitude, because she suddenly became more animated, more desperate in her attempts to control the narrative. "Daniel, you have to understand, I never knew about any of this. If I had known your mother was wealthy, if I had understood that she was supporting us financially, I never would have treated her the way I did." The defense was perhaps the most damning thing she could have said. Instead of expressing remorse for her cruelty, or acknowledging that elderly people deserved basic dignity regardless of their financial status, she was essentially admitting that her kindness was conditional on what people could do for her. "So you're saying that if I had been truly poor and dependent, your abuse would have been acceptable?" I asked quietly. "You're telling us that elderly people only deserve respect if they have money to contribute to your comfort?" Veronica realized too late that her words had revealed the fundamental ugliness of her character more clearly than any amount of evidence could have done. She had just admitted that her treatment of me had been based entirely on her perception of my powerlessness, and that she felt no moral obligation to treat vulnerable people with basic human decency. "That's not what I meant," she said desperately. "I just meant that if I had known the whole situation, I would have approached things differently. I would have been more understanding, more appreciative of everything you were doing for us. More appreciative of my money," I corrected. "Not more respectful of me as a person, not more considerate of my feelings, but more appreciative of my financial contributions. Thank you for clarifying exactly what I mean to you." The exchange had laid bare the transactional nature of Veronica's relationships in a way that even Daniel couldn't ignore. His wife didn't love people, she used them. She didn't respect individuals, she calculated their utility. And now that her calculations had proven so spectacularly wrong, she was facing consequences that would reshape every aspect of her existence. I opened another folder on my tablet, one that contained the documents that would demonstrate just how comprehensive those consequences would be. "Veronica," I said, "I want you to understand something very clearly. The criminal charges you're facing are just the beginning of your problems." She sat down heavily in the chair across from me, apparently realizing that our conversation was about to take an even more serious turn. "What do you mean?" she asked, though her voice suggested she was afraid to hear the answer. "I mean that I've spent months preparing for this moment, and criminal prosecution is only one element of the consequences you're going to face. I've been building a case that will ensure your cruelty is punished through every available channel." The folder I opened contained civil lawsuit documentation that my attorneys had been preparing for weeks. Invasion of privacy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, elder abuse, harassment, and a dozen other charges that would be pursued in civil court, regardless of what happened in the criminal justice system. "This is a civil lawsuit that will be filed tomorrow morning," I explained, showing them the legal documents. Unlike criminal charges, which require proof beyond a reasonable doubt, civil suits only require a preponderance of evidence. "And thanks to your illegal surveillance and my careful documentation, I have more than enough evidence to ensure victory in civil court." Veronica stared at the lawsuit papers as if they might spontaneously combust. Civil lawsuits could result in financial judgments that would follow her for the rest of her life, garnishing wages and seizing assets until the debt was satisfied. But the financial penalties were only part of what I had planned. The next folder contained documentation that would destroy her professional reputation in ways that criminal charges alone never could. I've also prepared a comprehensive report that will be sent to the Pharmaceutical Industry Ethics Board, your employer's Human Resources Department, and every professional organization you belong to. The report details your illegal surveillance activities, your systematic abuse of an elderly family member, and your complete lack of moral judgment in professional situations. The professional consequences would be immediate and permanent. The pharmaceutical industry took ethics violations seriously, especially those involving abuse of vulnerable populations. Veronica's career wouldn't just be damaged by these revelations, it would be completely destroyed. "You can't do that," she said desperately. That would ruin my career, my reputation, everything I've worked for. The irony of her protest was staggering. After spending years trying to ruin my relationship with my son and drive me out of the family, she was outraged that her own actions might have negative consequences for her professional life. You should have thought about that before you installed illegal surveillance equipment in your bathroom and tried to force me to clean your toilet with my bare hands in front of your colleagues, I replied calmly. Actions have consequences, Veronica, and you're about to learn exactly what those consequences look like when you abuse someone who has the resources to ensure justice is served. But even the civil lawsuit and professional destruction were only the beginning of what I had planned. The next folder contained the documents that would demonstrate the true scope of my power to reshape her life. There's also the matter of your financial security, I continued, opening records that detailed every aspect of their economic dependence on my support. Since you've made it clear that you view our relationship as purely transactional, let's discuss the terms of that transaction going forward. Daniel looked up sharply, clearly concerned about where this conversation was heading. Mom, what are you saying? Are you going to cut off our financial support because of what Veronica did? The question was reasonable, but it also showed that Daniel still didn't fully understand the extent of his wife's dependence on my resources or the leverage that gave me to ensure appropriate consequences for her behavior. I'm saying that Veronica's abuse of me was funded by my own money, and that dynamic is going to change immediately. She can't continue to benefit from the wealth of someone she's been systematically torturing. I pulled out a document that would formalize the new terms of any ongoing financial relationship. This is a behavioral contract that outlines the conditions under which any future support would be provided. It includes mandatory counseling, community service working with elderly populations, and regular accountability meetings to ensure that her behavior meets basic standards of human decency. The contract was comprehensive and humiliating, designed to ensure that Veronica could never again abuse someone she perceived as powerless while simultaneously benefiting from their resources. Every dollar of support would come with conditions that would remind her daily of the consequences of her cruelty. Veronica read through the contract with growing horror, realizing that her choices had been reduced to accepting these humiliating terms or facing complete financial ruin. The woman who had spent years exercising power over me was being offered her own version of the same choice she had tried to force on me. Submit to degrading conditions or lose everything. This is blackmail, she said weakly. This is accountability, I corrected. You want to continue benefiting from my financial support while facing minimal consequences for abusing me. I'm offering you a path forward that includes both support and appropriate boundaries to prevent future abuse. Daniel was reading over the contract with an expression that mixed admiration for my thoroughness with concern about the severity of the terms. Some of the requirements were indeed harsh, but they were also specifically designed to address the patterns of behavior that had made Veronica's abuse possible. The mandatory counseling would force her to confront the psychological issues that allowed her to view elderly people as acceptable targets for abuse. The community service would give her direct experience with the vulnerabilities she had exploited in me. The accountability meetings would ensure that any future support came with ongoing oversight to prevent a return to abusive patterns. But the most important element of the contract was the acknowledgement it required of my authority in family financial matters. Veronica would have to formally recognize that her comfortable lifestyle had been made possible by my generosity, and that continued support depended on her ability to demonstrate genuine change, rather than mere compliance. I need time to think about this, she said finally, pushing the contract away from her across the table. You have until tomorrow morning, I replied. The civil lawsuit will be filed regardless, but your response to this contract will determine whether it seeks maximum damages or allows for a more moderate resolution that accounts for your cooperation in making amends. The time pressure was deliberate. Veronica had spent years carefully planning her psychological attacks on me, taking time to craft each humiliation for maximum impact. Now she was being forced to make decisions about her future under the same kind of pressure she had subjected me to during her worst episodes of abuse. As Veronica left the kitchen to consider her options, Daniel and I sat in silence for several minutes. The magnitude of the changes that were about to reshape our family was difficult to process, even for someone who had been planning them for months. "Mom," he said finally, "I have to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Are you doing this because you want Veronica to change, or because you want her gone from our family?" The question cut to the heart of everything that would happen next. Was I offering her a path to redemption because I believed she could genuinely change? Or was I simply ensuring that her choice to leave would be made under conditions that provided appropriate consequences for her behavior? "I'm doing this because someone who systematically abuses elderly family members shouldn't be allowed to continue that behavior without facing serious consequences," I said carefully. Whether Veronica chooses to accept responsibility and change, or whether she chooses to leave rather than face accountability, the most important thing is that the abuse stops permanently. Daniel nodded slowly, understanding that my primary goal was protection rather than punishment, even though the two might look very similar from Veronica's perspective. Someone who had never experienced accountability for their cruelty might find it difficult to distinguish between consequences and revenge. But there was another element to consider, one that I hadn't yet discussed with Daniel but that would become relevant depending on Veronica's choice. If she decided to fight rather than accept accountability, I was prepared to escalate my response in ways that would make her current problems seem trivial by comparison. The phone rang, interrupting our conversation. Daniel answered and had a brief conversation with someone who was apparently calling about the police investigation. When he hung up, his expression was grim. "That was Detective Morrison. He wants us to come to the station this afternoon for follow-up interviews. He said they've been analyzing the recording device and found something we need to discuss." The development wasn't unexpected, but it did accelerate the timeline for everything I had planned. Police investigations had a way of uncovering information that people preferred to keep hidden, and I suspected that Veronica's surveillance activities had been more extensive than even I had realized. More importantly, the police investigation would provide official documentation of her crimes that could be used to support the civil lawsuit and professional ethics complaints. Every piece of evidence they gathered would strengthen my case and make it more difficult for Veronica to argue that her actions had been misunderstood or taken out of context. When Veronica came back downstairs an hour later, she looked even more haggard than before. The reality of her situation was clearly sinking in, and the multiple channels of accountability she was facing had apparently overwhelmed her ability to maintain her usual confident facade. "I've been thinking about everything you said," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "About the contract, about the lawsuit, about the professional consequences. I need you to understand that I never intended for things to go this far." The statement was carefully worded to express regret without accepting full responsibility, another example of Veronica's instinct to minimize and deflect, even when facing overwhelming evidence of her misconduct. "But intentions don't matter when the harm is this extensive," I replied. "You didn't accidentally install surveillance equipment in the bathroom. You didn't accidentally spend years trying to drive me out of my son's life. You didn't accidentally try to humiliate me in front of your colleagues. These were deliberate choices that caused real harm." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of my attorney, whom I had called that morning to discuss the next steps in the legal process. Jennifer Walsh was a formidable woman in her 50s who specialized in elder abuse cases, and had been preparing for this moment almost as long as I had been documenting Veronica's behavior. "Mrs. Chen," she said as she settled into a chair at our kitchen table, "I've reviewed all the documentation you provided, and I have to say this is one of the most comprehensive abuse cases I've ever seen. Between the illegal surveillance, the systematic psychological abuse, and the financial fraud implications, we have multiple avenues for both criminal and civil prosecution." The phrase, "financial fraud implications," seemed to hit Veronica like a physical blow. She hadn't considered that accepting financial support under false pretenses while abusing the provider might constitute fraud, but my attorney's analysis suggested that this interpretation was not only possible but likely. "Financial fraud?" Daniel asked, looking confused. "Mrs. Harrison has been accepting substantial financial support from Mrs. Chen while deliberately concealing that she was systematically abusing her," Jennifer explained. "In legal terms, this could be considered fraud by deception, obtaining money or benefits through deliberate misrepresentation of the circumstances." The fraud angle added another layer of potential criminal charges that could result in federal prosecution and prison time. Veronica's situation was deteriorating rapidly, and every new development made her initial choice to abuse me seem more catastrophically stupid. Jennifer laid out several documents on the table, each representing a different aspect of the legal case we would be pursuing. The civil lawsuit would seek damages for emotional distress, invasion of privacy, and elder abuse. The criminal referral would request prosecution for illegal surveillance, harassment, and fraud. The professional ethics complaints would seek permanent sanctions that would effectively end Veronica's career. "Mrs. Harrison," Jennifer said, addressing Veronica directly, "I want to make sure you understand the full scope of what you're facing. If we pursue all available legal remedies, you could be looking at federal criminal charges, substantial civil damages, and permanent professional sanctions. Your options for minimizing these consequences are extremely limited and time-sensitive." The legal assessment was delivered with the kind of professional detachment that made it even more terrifying than emotional threats would have been. This wasn't personal revenge or family drama anymore. This was a comprehensive legal assault being conducted by someone with unlimited resources and no motivation to show mercy. "What would I have to do to minimize the consequences?" Veronica asked desperately. "Accept full responsibility for your actions, agree to substantial damages in the civil case, cooperate completely with law enforcement, and comply with the behavioral contract Mrs. Chen has offered," Jennifer replied. "Even then, some consequences will be unavoidable. Your professional reputation is probably beyond salvaging, and criminal charges will likely be filed regardless of your cooperation." The stark assessment of her situation seemed to break something fundamental in Veronica's psychology. For years, she had been the one controlling situations and manipulating outcomes to her advantage. Now she was completely powerless, facing consequences that would reshape her entire life, with no ability to charm or manipulate her way out of accountability. But even as Veronica struggled to accept the reality of her situation, I knew that the most difficult revelations were still to come. The police investigation would soon uncover evidence that would make her current problems seem trivial by comparison, and when that happened, her choices would become even more limited than they already were. The reckoning I had planned for 3 years was finally beginning, and Veronica was about to learn that there were consequences in this world for people who chose cruelty over kindness, especially when they directed that cruelty towards someone who had both the resources and the determination to ensure that justice was comprehensive and lasting. The police station interview that afternoon revealed depths to Veronica's surveillance activities that shocked even me. Detective Morrison led us into a sterile conference room where the recording device sat on the table like an accusation waiting to be proven. The technical analysis had uncovered storage capabilities far beyond what we'd initially understood, and the implications were staggering. "Mrs. Chen," the detective said, addressing me with the kind of respect that made Veronica visibly flinch, "we've discovered that this device has been recording continuously for approximately 8 months. The storage capacity indicates over 200 hours of recorded material, most of it capturing private moments in your bathroom activities." The scope of the violation was even more extensive than I'd imagined. 8 months of secret surveillance meant that Veronica had been documenting my most vulnerable moments since almost the beginning of my current stay in their house. Every shower, every private moment, every instance of the physical vulnerability that comes with aging had been captured and stored for her purposes. But Detective Morrison wasn't finished with his revelations. "More concerning," he continued, "is that we've found evidence of remote access capabilities. This device was designed to transmit recordings to external storage, which means the material may have been shared with others or stored in locations we haven't yet identified. The possibility that my private recordings might have been distributed to others sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the police station. Veronica hadn't just been spying on me for her own entertainment or manipulation purposes. She had potentially been sharing my humiliation with unknown parties for reasons I couldn't even imagine." Daniel's face had gone completely white as he processed this information. His wife hadn't just been cruel to his mother. She had been conducting what amounted to a sophisticated surveillance operation that violated every principle of privacy and human dignity. "Mrs. Harrison," Detective Morrison said, turning his attention to Veronica, "we're going to need you to provide us with all passwords, account information, and access details for any systems connected to this surveillance equipment. We need to determine the full scope of where these recordings may have been stored or shared. Veronica's response was barely audible. I don't know anything about remote access or external storage. I just thought it was recording locally to the device itself. The claim of ignorance was undermined by the sophistication of the equipment itself. This wasn't consumer-grade recording equipment that someone might purchase without understanding its capabilities. This was professional surveillance technology that required specific knowledge to install and operate effectively. "Ma'am," the detective replied with obvious skepticism, "the technical specifications of this device make it clear that its primary function is networked surveillance with cloud storage capabilities. Someone with no technical knowledge wouldn't have been able to install or operate this equipment without detailed instructions or assistance." The implication was clear. Either Veronica had far more technical expertise than she was admitting, or she had received help from others in conducting her surveillance operation. Either possibility suggested that her crimes were more extensive and organized than we had initially understood. Jennifer Walsh, my attorney, leaned forward with the kind of predatory focus that had made her reputation in elder abuse cases. "Detective Morrison, if there's evidence of a broader surveillance network or conspiracy, how would that affect the charges Mrs. Harrison is facing?" "It would elevate the case to federal jurisdiction," he replied grimly. Interstate transmission of illegally obtained recordings, especially those involving vulnerable populations, falls under federal privacy statutes, with much more severe penalties than state-level charges. Federal charges. The phrase seemed to drain whatever remaining color existed in Veronica's face. Federal prosecution meant federal prison, federal sentencing guidelines, and a level of legal scrutiny that would expose every aspect of her life to examination. But the revelations weren't finished. Detective Morrison opened a laptop and showed us preliminary analysis of the recording timestamps and activity patterns. Based on the metadata, Mrs. Harrison, it appears that someone has been accessing these recordings regularly, not just storing them passively. There's evidence of frequent review, editing, and file manipulation that suggests ongoing active use of the surveillance material. The active use of the recordings suggested purposes that went beyond simple spying. Someone had been curating and manipulating the material, possibly for blackmail, entertainment, or distribution to others. The criminal implications were expanding by the hour. Veronica finally seemed to understand that her situation had moved far beyond local criminal charges and civil lawsuits. She was potentially facing federal prosecution for crimes that could result in decades in prison, and every new revelation made her initial decision to abuse me seem more incomprehensibly stupid. "I want to speak to a lawyer," she said suddenly, her voice cracking with desperation. "I'm not answering any more questions without legal representation." "That's your right," Detective Morrison replied. "But I should inform you that we've already obtained warrants to search your home, your workplace, and your electronic devices. Your cooperation could influence how aggressively we pursue the more serious charges. But the investigation will continue regardless." The search warrants represented a complete invasion of Veronica's privacy in return for her invasion of mine. Every aspect of her life would be examined for evidence of additional crimes or victims. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for years had been permanently reversed. As we left the police station, the weight of everything that had been revealed settled over our family like a suffocating blanket. Veronica was facing criminal charges that could destroy her life, while Daniel was grappling with the realization that he'd been married to someone capable of systematic cruelty and potentially federal crimes. But for me, the most important revelation was the confirmation that my months of careful planning and documentation had been justified. Veronica's abuse hadn't been a series of isolated incidents or personality conflicts. It had been an organized campaign of psychological warfare, conducted by someone with the technical sophistication and moral emptiness to turn surveillance into a weapon. That evening, we gathered in the living room of the house that Veronica was now learning belonged to me. The behavioral contract lay on the coffee table between us, but the day's revelations had made its terms seem almost quaint compared to the federal charges she was facing. Jennifer had spent the afternoon refining our legal strategy based on the new information from the police investigation. The civil lawsuit would now include damages for industrial-scale privacy violations and potential distribution of intimate recordings. The professional ethics complaints would highlight not just local abuse, but organized criminal behavior that violated every standard of professional conduct. Veronica sat across from me looking like someone who had aged a decade in a single day. The confident, manipulative woman who had spent years tormenting me had been replaced by someone who was clearly terrified about her future and completely overwhelmed by the consequences of her choices. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began hesitantly, her voice lacking any of its usual manipulative undertones. "About taking responsibility, about accepting the contract terms, about trying to make amends for what I've done." The words sounded like the beginning of genuine accountability. But I had learned over the years to be skeptical of Veronica's apparent transformations. Someone who had spent months conducting illegal surveillance while systematically abusing an elderly family member wasn't likely to experience authentic moral awakening simply because she'd been caught. "What exactly are you saying?" Daniel asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Are you admitting that you've been abusing my mother deliberately and systematically for years?" "Yes," Veronica said quietly, the single word falling into the silence like a stone into still water. "I've been cruel to your mother because I wanted her to stop coming to stay with us. I thought if I made her uncomfortable enough, she would leave on her own and we could have our lives back." The admission was more comprehensive than anything I'd expected, but it also revealed the fundamental selfishness that had motivated her behavior. Even in her moment of supposed accountability, Veronica was framing her abuse in terms of her own desires, rather than acknowledging the harm she'd caused to another human being. "And the surveillance equipment?" Jennifer prompted. "How do you explain the sophisticated recording operation we discovered?" Veronica's pause before answering suggested that this question was more complicated than the simple admission of psychological abuse. "I wanted to document her behavior so I could show Daniel how difficult she was to live with. I thought if I could prove that she was becoming confused or demanding, he would agree that she needed to live somewhere else." The explanation was carefully crafted to minimize criminal intent while acknowledging enough responsibility to potentially mitigate charges. But it also revealed that Veronica's surveillance had been part of a deliberate campaign to manipulate Daniel's perception of his mother and drive a permanent wedge between us. "So you installed professional surveillance equipment in our bathroom to manufacture evidence against my mother?" Daniel's voice was incredulous. "You violated her privacy for months to create fake documentation of problems that didn't exist?" The strategy was even more calculated than I'd initially understood. Veronica hadn't just been abusing me for her own satisfaction. She had been building a false case against me to justify future abuse and eventually convince Daniel that I was the problem in our family dynamic. But her plan had backfired spectacularly because she'd never bothered to investigate who she was really targeting. The surveillance equipment that was supposed to document my supposed decline had instead captured evidence of her own criminal behavior, while my actual resources and capabilities had been revealed to be far beyond anything she'd imagined. The irony was perfect. Veronica's attempt to manufacture evidence against me had instead provided the documentation needed to ensure her own destruction. Her sophisticated surveillance operation had become the primary evidence in the case against her. Jennifer pulled out the updated behavioral contract that reflected the day's revelations. "Mrs. Harrison, given what we've learned about the scope of your surveillance activities, the terms for any possible resolution have changed significantly. The original contract assumed local criminal charges and civil liability. Federal crimes require much more comprehensive accountability measures. The new contract was substantially more demanding than the original version. In addition to the mandatory counseling and community service, Veronica would now be required to surrender all electronic devices for forensic examination, provide complete cooperation with federal investigators, and accept monitoring that would continue for years after any criminal proceedings concluded. More significantly, the financial terms had been adjusted to reflect the scale of her violations. Instead of modest damages for local abuse, she would now be liable for substantial penalties that would ensure she could never benefit financially from her crimes in any way. This contract represents your only opportunity to avoid maximum prosecution and civil damages, Jennifer explained. If you reject these terms, we'll pursue every available legal remedy without any consideration for cooperation or remorse. Veronica read through the new contract with growing horror, clearly understanding that her choices had been reduced to accepting comprehensive accountability or facing total destruction through the legal system. The woman who had spent years controlling and manipulating others was being offered her own version of the same choice she'd tried to force on me: submit to humiliating terms or lose everything. But unlike the false choice she'd attempted to impose on me, this ultimatum was backed by legitimate authority and overwhelming evidence of actual wrongdoing. She could accept accountability for her crimes, or face the full consequences of challenging someone with unlimited resources and ironclad documentation of her misconduct. The decision process took 3 days. During that time, federal agents executed search warrants at Veronica's workplace and discovered additional surveillance equipment that had been installed in conference rooms and private offices. Her systematic violation of privacy hadn't been limited to our family. It had been part of a broader pattern of illegal surveillance that had violated the rights of her colleagues and potentially compromised corporate information. The workplace discoveries elevated her charges to include industrial espionage and corporate surveillance, crimes that carried mandatory prison sentences regardless of cooperation or plea agreements. Veronica's situation had deteriorated to the point where even complete compliance with our behavioral contract wouldn't protect her from serious federal prison time. When she finally returned to our kitchen table to provide her decision, Veronica looked like someone who had been broken by the weight of consequences she'd never imagined possible. The sophisticated manipulator who had tortured me for years had been reduced to someone who was simply trying to minimize the destruction of her own life. "I'll sign the contract," she said quietly. "I'll accept all the terms, provide complete cooperation with the investigation, and do whatever is necessary to make amends for what I've done." The capitulation was complete, but it also came too late to prevent the most serious consequences of her choices. Federal prosecutors had decided to pursue charges regardless of her cooperation, and her professional reputation had been permanently destroyed by the workplace surveillance discoveries. But signing the contract did provide some protection for Daniel and the children from the financial fallout of her crimes. The terms I'd negotiated would ensure that her legal problems didn't destroy the innocent members of our family, even as they held her accountable for years of deliberate cruelty. 6 months later, I sat in my garden behind the house that everyone now knew belonged to me, watching my grandchildren play while Daniel worked nearby on architectural plans for a renovation project. Veronica was serving her federal sentence at a minimum security facility, where she would remain for the next 4 years while learning what accountability meant for someone who had spent her life avoiding consequences. The transformation in our family dynamics had been profound. Daniel had emerged from his marriage's destruction with a clearer understanding of his own values and a renewed appreciation for the importance of protecting vulnerable family members from those who would exploit their trust. The children had adapted to their mother's absence with the resilience that children often show when toxic influences are removed from their environment. They spent more time with me now, learning about business and investments, and developing the kind of strong family relationships that Veronica had spent years trying to destroy. But the most important change was in my own sense of security and dignity. For the first time in years, I could move through my family's life without fear of humiliation or manipulation. The systematic abuse that had made me question my own worth and judgment had been exposed and punished, while my true position in the family had been acknowledged and respected. The financial revelations had led to important conversations about wealth, responsibility, and family obligations. Daniel now understood that his comfortable lifestyle had been supported by careful investment in business management rather than luck or natural talent. The children were learning about the importance of treating all people with dignity, regardless of their perceived status or resources. Most importantly, we had all learned that cruelty directed toward vulnerable people carries consequences that extend far beyond the immediate harm it causes. Veronica's systematic abuse of someone she thought was powerless had ultimately destroyed every aspect of her own life, while teaching our family valuable lessons about the importance of character over appearances. The recording devices had been destroyed, the surveillance network dismantled, and the privacy violations prosecuted to the full extent of federal law. But the deeper lessons about human dignity and family loyalty would continue to shape our relationships for generations to come. As I watched my grandchildren playing in the garden that Veronica had once treated as her exclusive domain, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction that justice had been served, and my family had been protected from someone who had proven herself capable of systematic cruelty toward those she perceived as beneath her consideration. The woman who had tried to force me to clean toilets with my bare hands was now cleaning institutional bathrooms as part of her prison work assignment, learning firsthand what humiliation felt like when directed at someone with no power to resist or escape. But more importantly, she was finally facing the consequences of choices that had revealed her true character when she thought no one was watching or documenting her behavior. The surveillance operation she'd conducted against me had ultimately provided the evidence needed to ensure that her cruelty was comprehensively punished, and that she could never again use her position of apparent authority to abuse vulnerable family members. The house was peaceful now, filled with the kind of genuine warmth and affection that had been impossible, while Veronica's toxicity poisoned every family interaction. We had learned that family relationships built on mutual respect and genuine care were infinitely more valuable than those maintained through manipulation and fear. And I had learned that sometimes the best gift you can give your family is the willingness to hold toxic people accountable for their behavior, even when that accountability requires resources and determination that others might not possess. The strength I'd built through decades of business success had ultimately been used to protect the people I loved most from someone who had proven herself unworthy of their trust and affection. The toilet incident that had triggered this entire reckoning now seemed like a distant memory, but its lessons continued to resonate through our daily lives. Dignity and respect weren't negotiable based on someone's perceived wealth or status. Cruelty toward vulnerable people carried consequences that could reshape entire lives. And family loyalty meant protecting each other from those who would exploit trust and affection for their own selfish purposes. As the sun set over our garden and my grandchildren came inside for dinner, I reflected on how completely our family had been transformed by the revelation of truth and the implementation of appropriate consequences for systematic abuse. We were stronger now, more honest about our relationships and clearer about our values. And Veronica was learning, in her federal prison cell, that the woman she'd thought she could abuse with impunity had possessed resources and determination that made her choice of victims the most catastrophic mistake of her life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.